So welcome today to the second part of the book of Ruth. And I'm doing the first 2 minutes because this is all Elizabeth's stuff on Ruth. And so she'll be leading you right through the session as she did last week. So as we gather, we acknowledge the first peoples of the nations where we are. We acknowledge them as the custodians of the country on which we meet.
Well, welcome to our last session on Ruth, and we'll be covering chapters 3 and 4. And you should have all got in the email something from John yesterday that set out some notes for you and some homework and some questions. And we're starting with Naomi's statement to Ruth in verses 1 to 5, where she launches into a conversation where she states she needs to seek some security for you so it may be well with you. In our society today, that could be understood as seeking out a rich man and marrying for money. And we tend to frown on such things. And it's shown by media scorn for younger women marrying rich older men. So what do we make of this statement of Naomi to Ruth? And we'll just talk about that in the big group. How did it strike you when you read this?
I think you've got to read the rest of chapter 3 and 4 to see it in context. And when you've done that, you realise that Naomi is being rather manipulative. She's arranging what I read as Ruth's seduction of Boaz.
That's exactly what she's doing. So, even without reading in the rest of the chapters, that's exactly what she's doing. Anyone else have any any comments on this?
I guess Naomi's also conscious that Ruth can't go on forever living off the gleanings from the field, that she needs ongoing security. And Naomi won't always be there, not that she provides any of that for her. But I guess she's looking at her welfare long term.
Yep. Any other comments on that?
I was just going to say that, you know, when we view it with our eyes, it's very different. We're looking at a society where women were, you know, and these women in particular were really powerless. So what other options have they got?
That's exactly true. It's a society where women's fate will always depend on men, generally in one way or the other, unless you're a wealthy woman. If you're a wealthy woman with means, of course, and you're widowed and you have treasures from your wealthy merchant husband, you may fare better, but not in this agrarian society here. Any other comments?
I thought Naomi was opportunistic where when Ruth came home with all his food and the light dawned on Naomi, then she took the opportunity of developing all the proceedings that were to happen in chapters 3 and 4. And I also think that Naomi, and naturally enough, no criticism to Naomi in the story, I think she was also not only looking after Ruth, but I think she was looking after herself.
Thank you for that, Rosemary. I was wondering if someone was going to mention self-interest, because that has to be a part here. No one else is looking after Naomi at the moment other than Ruth. So self-interest has to be part of this. Now, I gave you some homework because Naomi does give some rather detailed instructions to Ruth about what she is to go and do. Obviously, she's got some intelligence about Boaz's movements and what he's up to. And I'm set a task for you to explore in Hebrew scripture and stories what a threshing floor can mean. Who has done this homework and discovered an answer?
Well, actually, I found it very interesting, actually, wandering off the path a bit about things there's many layers to the threshing floor. And I suppose the way I see it in this one comes up is that Naomi would have known that Boaz was probably going to sleep by the threshing floor because of the risk of having stopped stealing of the goods.
Yeah.
And so therefore she was, in a way, it alluded to other activities that could actually happen there at times. The threshing floor also has many other layers to it as well. There was quite a bit to do with the threshing floor.
Well, just summarise it in a sentence. What connotations does the threshing floor hold? As I've been down to the threshing floor, how would that be interpreted?
It's almost like you're having a relationship with someone there.
It's not almost like Mary.
It is.
Is that what you discovered, Margaret?
No, what I found was that in Hebrew writings, threshing floors were considered sacred spaces connected to Yahweh. That he appears at threshing floors which were under his control, and he provided the grain threshed and winnowed there. And it's connected with Israel's belief in Yahweh's important role in livelihood and survival and the locations of food and sustenance.
Can I ask you where you found that?
Yes, there's someone's PhD thesis I found online. It was really interesting.
Yes, interesting,
Actually,
but I would probably want to violently argue with most of it.
It was all about threshing floors, but the bit about Ruth and Boaz only appeared in a sort of an addendum.
Now, Kate's got a hand up.
Yeah, what I discovered that the threshing floor was known as a place where after the guys had worked hard all day, they'd drink a lot of wine and the prostitutes would come in, and that's, you know, who knows what went on, because a lot of people were away from their normal home and they weren't in their family situation, and so anything goes really on the threshing room floor.
I think gold star to Kate. I think Kate's nailed it. If you look at different things in Hebrew scripture, the threshing floor was a place where immoral sexual behaviour took place, or what was considered immoral sexual behaviour took place. We're going to look at the prophet Hosea, and I'm going to use that to say Kate's bang on the money. And the prophet Hosea in chapter 9, verse 1 says, "Do not rejoice, O Israel. Do not exult as other nations do, for you have played the whore. Departing from your God, you have loved a prostitute's pay on the threshing floors." So, and Boaz himself knows that a woman's reputation could be ruined by a visit to a threshing floor, because he says to Ruth in chapter 3, "It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." He knows what that will mean. So here we have Ruth Naomi is instructing Ruth to do a number of things. So she's instructing Ruth to wear her best clothes, to put on perfume, and go to this place of dubious assignation between men and women. So Ruth, I don't know what you think of Naomi's advice here. We'll come back to that. But how do I know that's going on? Well, thanks to the book of Ezekiel in chapter 16, the Lord describes his liaison with the young female Israel, and he's basically describing the rights of being, this is probably an arranged marriage, of what exactly happens. And it's very graphic. I've never liked this passage, but we're going to look at it. "I passed you again." Now, the you in this is Israel. And it says that initially before this, it says, "I found you as an abandoned infant squalling, and I cut your umbilical cord and I looked after you." And then it comes to this: "I passed by you again and I looked on you. You were at an age for love." And this is going to have some extra things in it that will become relevant later in the story. "I spread the edge of my cloak over you and covered your nakedness. I pledged myself to you and entered into a covenant with you and covered your nakedness. I pledged myself to you and entered into a covenant with you, says the Lord," in case you missed the point, "and you became mine. I bathed you with water. I washed off the blood from you and anointed you with oil. I clothed you with embroidered cloth, with sandals. I bound you in fine linen and covered you with rich fabric." So we've got an outline here of actually what happens in a marital relationship for the first time, when a man is, there's been an exchange of some sort of dowry and an agreement, and a woman is given to a husband, and what goes on. So we find that we have here, Ruth is to wear her best clothes and her perfume. We see this as something similar here in Ezekiel, and she set off to the threshing floor. So what do you think Naomi is actually proposing Ruth do with this information?
Secure her future.
Yes, she's securing a future, but by what means, Patricia?
Almost prostituting herself.
Well, pretty much. It is a seduction. It's a complete seduction. And that's what is going on. And Ezekiel helps us understand that this is a seduction, because what Ruth is being directed to do by Naomi is put all the things on you'd expect a woman to do when she wanted to seduce a man. Wash herself. You notice that in Ezekiel, a lot of washing was going on. So wash herself, put her best clothes on, wear perfume. It's not even subtle. The author here isn't even trying to be subtle. So Naomi instructs Ruth to wait until Boaz has sated with food and drink, so he's probably a little bit tipsy at least. In verse 7, this is described as Boaz being contented. That's a bit of a euphemism for he's had a bit to drink and his mood is mellowed. Naomi's further instructions include not making herself known till Boaz is finished in drinking. We need him mellow so he doesn't get a bit antsy about it. And then tells Ruth to watch where he lies and then go and uncover his feet. And that was the next part of your homework. Now, Tuggeranong people ought to know this because we've encountered it in a number of our Bible studies.
Yes, we do.
Non-Tuggeranong people, did you discover what feet is the euphemism for?
Male genitals.
That's exactly right, male genitals. So uncovering his feet is a pretty kind of racy thing to say, but that's what it means. So that's what Naomi instructs Ruth to do, to lie down near him, uncover his feet, and then Boaz would tell her what to do, and I'm sure he does. So it's worthy of note that in verse 4 and 7, we have a lot of symbolism that's operating well. And Ruth is instructed to lay down with Boaz. It's not at the foot of his bed or his little feet. And to lay with someone, you probably know in the Hebrew Bible, also is a euphemism. And there's a lot of things like heaps of grain, and there's a lot of fertility kind of suggestions. And of course, we find the euphemism for feet in other places, such as when we looked at King David telling Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. Now, he's not going and say literally have a bath. That is not what David is suggesting Uriah do. And Uriah refuses because he says that's a pleasure that his men do not have, and he is not going to be indulging in that with his wife when his men are on the battlefield. And of course, David's trying to get his child passed off as Uriah's. In 1 Samuel 24, Saul goes in and he goes in and uncovers his feet. That is, he's relieving himself. So there's plenty of examples in the Hebrew Bible with this euphemism of feet. Isaiah 6 is another one with the seraphim. You've probably been told angels are genderless. Well, not the seraphim.
Elizabeth, can I just ask here a question or make an observation? For countless generations, we've interpreted the book of Ruth as an endearing little story about the love between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. A nice, simple, reassuring story about the love between two women who are related by marriage. How did we get it so wrong when it's obviously a story of manipulation, seduction, playing with each other's genitals like it's anything but this story of a love between an older and a younger woman?
Look, Ian, we've got a tendency especially in the earlier part of the 20th century, coming out of Victorian times, to sanitise things. Don't think biblical scholars didn't understand the sort of stuff I'm saying. They did, but that's not what you taught your Sunday school or your church. You put a gloss on it and you read it literally without enlightening people what some of it meant. Even reading it literally, it would raise questions. Because, I mean, here's this woman at midnight on a threshing floor taking off Boaz's cloak, even if it's not his feet. She's still doing something pretty dodgy. But we've sanitised it and we've made it this sort of story of faith and piety and obedience, because that's what the values were that the church wished to imbue into people. That's what happened. And it's happened with a lot of stories. A lot of you would have been taught Samson was this great hero in Sunday school. Samson is possibly the most idiotic, boneheaded, evil character that the Bible has ever produced. And if you don't believe me, read his story in the book of Judges. The number of people that died at Samson's hand quite deliberately, the ruthless acts of cruelty that that man committed, he deserved everything he got from Delilah. So, you know, and his one moment of glory is when he pulls the temple down. Up until that time, he's just been an absolute menace, and a very stupid one at that. So we just sanitize stuff. There's a lot of stories like that and stories in the book of Judges that we either leave out or we just completely sanitize. And as I said, the Victorian age is to blame for much of it. Okay, let us press on.
Right.
So we've got another euphemism here, and that is uncover. Now, we've just seen in the verses from Ezekiel to uncover. I covered your nakedness, or I uncovered you. It's another euphemism for intercourse. If you ask someone to throw a cloak over you, it's a euphemism for intercourse. If you uncover them, it's a euphemism for intercourse in the Hebrew Bible. And we can see this in things like Leviticus 18, 16 to 19. Cursed be anyone who lies, well, that's laying down next to someone. And here you can see, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother. Now, this isn't saying that don't go and take their clothes off them. This is actually saying is you won't commit incest. So it's a euphemism for that. So Naomi is sending Ruth into a place of dubious reputation, a threshing floor, washed, best clothed and perfumed up, to uncover the feet of a man who may be drunk and ask him to spread his cloak over her. If you're an ancient Hebrew, by this time you're probably thinking you're watching or reading or hearing soft porn. So I've asked a question there. Do you think these instructions are actually wise? Naomi, how do you feel about Naomi sending Ruth into this situation with these instructions?
I think she's desperate.
You think she's desperate?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can understand it, because Ruth's already met Boaz, and from what you read, she seems that he's agreeable. And she also understands that he's looking after her, because he did when he found her in the fields.
Yes, exactly.
So
yes.
She may not have been as opposed to it as just reading it literally would suggest, and that she actually is quite agreeable to do it. And being a Moabite woman, she doesn't have a lot of choices.
No, she doesn't. And she's also got a reputation of sexual immorality, probably not deserved, but as we noted last week, Moabite women were slurred.
Yes.
It's a racist slur that was made against them.
She wouldn't be frightened because she's not a virgin. She knows what's going on.
Well, this is true. She's a widow. So we understand that. You're quite right. It's not like sending a very young girl with no experience into this. And Naomi knows Boaz is interested because of all the food he's been giving to Ruth. So there is danger here. They may be caught. And if Ruth is caught in this situation, she could face stoning. She could face being driven out of town. It is a risky situation. But as you've all pointed out, they're running out of options.
The other thing is what's happened to the men, the family, Naomi's family?
Oh, good question, Kate.
They haven't stepped up.
No.
Really, it's the women who now need to take the action. And
that's right.
And they have limited options as to how they do that. So I would have thought that Naomi may have hoped that Ruth would get pregnant. You know, it's more than having intercourse, because you're in a granary, there's lots of fertility symbols.
Exactly.
And that would then, possibly bind Boaz to her more firmly and secure her future.
I think probably the aim of this is to get Boaz to marry Ruth. I think that's probably the aim of this. And Ruth's actions indicate that's what she expects, but we'll get to that. Now, I did set you another homework question, which I've really answered, which is, what does spread your cloak over me mean? Well, we've understood that's saying I'm available for intercourse. She is, Ruth is conveying that she could be a wife or a concubine. Now, I'm suggesting what Ruth is trying to invoke here is the Levirate law. She says, when Boaz jumps up and sort of he's startled, and we'll get to that too, she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. Ruth is saying to Boaz, you are the one that she's responsible, with the lack of a brother, for producing an heir for my dead husband. That's what she's saying. So she's actually invoking the Levirate law here when she says you are next of kin. She's expecting the next male in the line of relationship to her dead husband would be someone who would help her produce a child that would carry on that dead husband's name and any sort of possessions that he has. So I think that she is clear. She's clear here, I think, that, you know, she wants this all legit. She wants this seen as either marriage is in view, or that the child she would hopefully get from this liaison would be seen as a product of the Levirate law, acceptable and able to inherit land, etc., etc. So I think that's what's going on there. Now, the time is important. In the Hebrew Bible, time's always important. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but midnight is a very, very important time in the Hebrew Bible. It's when the firstborn of the Egyptians were slain and the Israelites liberated. It's when Jacob wrestles with his mysterious man at the river. And here the impression given, because it's midnight, is that the time itself wakes Boaz, not the presence of Ruth. Because the NRSV says Boaz is startled, but a better translation is he sort of shudders awake and he's quaking or trembling, usually due to fear. Boaz, who is the assured wealthy landowner in control of himself by day, at night has become rather unsure and afraid, and it is Ruth who is actually in command in this particular scenario. So poor old Boaz is probably thinking, what's going on? Who is this woman? Why am I shuddering? How did I wake up this way? And just how much wine did I really drink? What, you know, am I seeing hallucinations? So Boaz cannot adopt the attitude of a social superior here. He can't ask a servant now, who does this woman belong to? He has to ask her himself, and she takes control of the situation. Now, Boaz, we know, must be older because he praises Ruth for picking him, basically, rather than a younger man. And he assures her that he will protect her reputation. That is, he'll make sure she's not caught on the threshing floor, and he won't be going around saying, guess who visited me last night? So Boaz requests she lays at his feet till morning, and that itself is probably euphemistic as well. And though the issue of marriage hasn't been decided, Boaz, because Boaz has recognised there may be another Goel or Redeemer that has a greater claim, he is going to hatch a plan to try and fix that. So he sends it back to Naomi, laden with more food again, lots of grain. Naomi seems very confident that there will be a good outcome. So there's an awful lot going on here. Now, this is a place of contrast again. It's like the last chapter, but now we're in the female domain. We're in the dark. Ruth is in control. She is the one that's setting the agenda here. And we have contrasts again. Male and female, foreigner and Israelite, rich and poor are still here in this chapter. But in the public place where social customs were maintained, this has been reversed here. In private, in the cover of darkness, unrestrained by custom, their interaction is very different than it was in the field. Boaz's prominence, riches, and public profile are not as important here. This is a plot that's been hatched by women. It's being carried out by women. It's a time of danger and a time of promise and blessing. And there's that potential there for fertility. But even despite this bold initiative, and it's well received by Boaz, and Ruth gets away with it, no one catches her there, their fate as women is still going to rest in the hands of men. And it's the hands of a man with wealth and status. So Boaz needs to fulfill his part of the plan in the public and male sphere of life. And that's where we're going to swap to in the next chapter, in chapter 4. And that stands in contrast with Ruth's actions, a plan that was hatched and fulfilled in the darkness, in private and conceived by women. So we have a question here for you to think about in your groups. What about this chapter is subversive in the dominant culture? Why do you think the author is telling the story this way? I think that's an important point to consider. So what is subversive here, and why is the author telling the story this way? So we're going to spend a few minutes discussing that in our breakout rooms. Does anyone want to share some insights from their group on the questions?
Sue Wald, ask Sue.
Sue Wald, what insights do you have?
Okay, what I was saying was it is subversive in that it's turning the accepted views of the society on its head. So women are supposed to be passive and subservient, and in fact they're not in this story. And Moabites are supposed to be, you know, evil and dreadful, and yet this has been turned on its head. And the heroine is actually a Moabite who becomes the, you know, the, sort of the grandmother of David.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's what we said in our group. At the end of the day, it comes back to Ruth being a Moabite and the matriarch of the Davidic, or a matriarch in the Davidic line. And that's where it all comes back to, whatever happens.
So it's a different view of it, but it isn't the normal way of going about getting a husband. But remember, Boaz can only be manipulated because the first time he clapped eyes on Ruth, he basically went, "Fwah," and they know it. And that's what they can manipulate. They know it. They know he's vulnerable and they know he's interested. And in their time, this is the only protection against want is a bloke.
I was going to say, I think Boaz has turned things on its head as well. He could have simply had a sexual encounter with her because he had no, she had no power over him except the law that she's quoted. So, you know, if a prominent businessman says, "Oh, guess what, I'm hooking up with this young refugee woman who's got no money," I mean, you could just imagine his mates thinking, "What the hell's gone on with you?" You know, so he's also stepping outside what might be expected from his society.
Yes, he could have just said, "I'll take you as a concubine," or he could have just raped her.
Yeah.
He could have done that, and he doesn't do that. And as he's interested enough that he wants this to be a permanent. He's obviously on his own, whether he's widowed or just never married, we don't know. He wants a companion. He wants Ruth because he's, as I said, he went first time he saw her. And we know it's going to all be blessed, all these wily machinations, because chapter 4 tells us it's going to be blessed. So we're going to move into chapter 4 now, and there's quite a few things to explain in this, and I'm sorry about that. You've got a lot of notes, but you need to understand them or it doesn't make sense. Firstly, we've got... we know Boaz is a Goel, that name, a redeemer. And he has said to Ruth, there's a nearer kinsman, and that nearer kinsman would also be a redeemer. Now, the nearer kinsman might be slightly closer in relationship to Naomi and the dead husband of Ruth. But the Hebrew here is really funny. It's never translated correctly. It'll say in your Bible something like, Boaz says, "Come here, friend." That is not what it says. It's Poloni Almoni. It's Hebrew writing slang, and it means, oh, what's his face, or such and such, or so-and-so, or Mr. Thingamy-bob. So Mr. Poloni Almoni, Boaz basically says, "Oi, what's your name? Get over here." And he does exactly what Boaz says. So he might be nearer in kinship, but Boaz in society is obviously far more prominent with a lot more status. So in the ancient Hebrew world, all the decisions about law, property, finances, judgments about disputes, etc., were made at the town gates. of any reasonably large village. And the men and elders would gather there and they would discuss aspects of law generally, but they would also enact judgments if people brought disputes to them. And you can see in Deuteronomy 21:18, which is up on your screen, if someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey father and mother, who does not heed them, they shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the town gate of that place. And then they'll pronounce some judgment on him. It's not a good one, but so we won't go there. Mr. What's-his-face has no idea what Boaz wants. He just waits at the gate and that Boaz is lying in wait with him to conduct some legal business. And we have the unsure Boaz who was quaking with fear the night before and being told to do basically by Ruth. He's been replaced with the very prominent, socially larger-than-life pillar of society, confident Boaz. And he does wield power in this society, as I said, because when he says to what's-his-name, sit down, he does that. When Boaz commands the elders to sit down, they do exactly what Boaz tells them. No one challenges him or questions his right of authority to do any of this. So Boaz is now going to put forward his case to the 10 elders and the other Goel, the other Redeemer. 10's an important number in this book, and it's one of the magical numbers of the Hebrew Bible generally. Naomi and her family spend 10 years in Moab. There are 10 generations of descendants in the genealogy at the end of the chapter. And here we have 10 elders. So whatever the outcome of this meeting, it's set in such a way that it's going to be legally binding. Now, Boaz is going to put a very careful argument here. The field, not Ruth, is presented as the main legal issue. And Boaz is at pains to stress that some form of the term of goel quite a number of times. So he's using this word a lot. He's also working the crowd, and we know that. It's not completely evident from the English translation, but it's evident there is a crowd, and he's addressing them as well because he notes they're sitting there. And he speaks to them as well as Mr. What's-his-name. So people have gathered to see what's going to transpire, even though our Bibles read as if he's just talking to the other Goel or Redeemer. Mr. What's-his-name falls into Boaz's trap, lured by Boaz's use of this word and this lure of this dangling carrot of a piece of land. Mr. What's-his-name states he will redeem the land. He's assumed it's a simple legal matter. Where Naomi has a piece of land she cannot work, but would benefit from selling it to and Hebrew law dictates the nearest kinsman gets first dibs on buying it. And that way, people who are poor in a family are looked after. So his role would be to buy or redeem the land from her and add to his real estate, and she would get the money which would allow her to live. Now, it's not as straightforward because this is the book of Ruth and nothing's straightforward in Ruth. Firstly, where did this parcel of land come from? Why haven't we heard about it before? Why is Naomi not redeeming this parcel of land? Why is Ruth going out and gleaning? Why all the schemes to latch Ruth onto Boaz if there's a block of land for sale? I put to you, Boaz could have just invented it as part of his trap because we've heard nothing about that before. Further, not only has been Boaz remiss in his kinship duties, we now discover old What's-his-face, who is a nearer kinsman, was also apparently happy to let Naomi starve to death or be reduced to dire poverty. Next, the story of Ruth is preceded on the assumption that Ruth and Naomi had nothing and returned to nothing. It tells you that. So why has Naomi been dependent on Ruth gleaming if she's got a block of land? Why cook up this assignation if there's a block of land to sell? And there's no indication, even if she has a block of land, she said anything about wanting it sold. She hasn't asked Boaz to act for her. She hasn't said she even actually has it. So is Boaz resorting to an imaginary piece of land to cover his real aim? That is to acquire Ruth as a wife, but in such a way that it's a legal duty which would remove from him any taint that he's marrying a Moabite. He needs the legal cover for this proceeding. For even though this is an enlightened book that's certainly putting to people in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah that foreigners are not that bad, for someone of Boaz's social standing to enter into a marriage with a Moabite, a foreigner, would be very, very risky to his reputation if there was no legal duty involved. So while Boaz is apparently concerned with the noble duty of redeeming his kinswoman Naomi's land, he can just slip in that Ruth's part of the deal. The success of such an enterprise hinges on the assumption that old what's-his-name will give up his rights. How can Boaz be so sure he will? How can Boaz be sure that this risk is going to pay off? Well, Hebrew inheritance laws are pretty complicated, and it's this fact that Boaz uses to make sure his sneaky manipulation of old what's-his-name is going to work. In verse 5, he throws in the complication of Ruth. The other Goel immediately says, I cannot redeem the land. It would damage my inheritance. That sounds like an odd response. How would the addition of Ruth damage what's-his-name's inheritance? Well,
because she's a Moabite.
Well, yes, that's part of it, but that might be that. But again, if there's a legal duty, it does change the scenario somewhat. And that's not bothering Boaz, so why would it bother old what's-his-name?
Because he's a snob.
There's a Mrs. What's-his-name. And Mrs. What's-his-name may have strong objection to the introduction of a younger foreign wife. Again, looking at the Hebrew is helpful here because our English translation is not quite bang on the money. Our Bible reads, the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. Now, that's the Levirate law being cited again here. There is an older version of the Hebrew that actually reads, the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, I am acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. Now, this is a masterly stroke on the part of Boaz. It's a trap. The other Goel might think he's going to add to his real estate withholdings without complication by buying this land off Naomi. But what Boaz is saying here is really important. If Boaz and Ruth actually have a child that carries on the name of her dead husband, who is Naomi's kinsman and the grandson of Naomi's husband, then the child would have the right to claim the land that Naomi is allegedly selling. That's what I mean. These are complicated. So if what's-his-name redeems this alleged piece of land from Naomi, it would be subject to a claim from any male descendant of the family. In this case, the child would, as I said, would be the grandson of Elimelech. And poor old what's-his-name would have spent his money for naught because that child could claim that land back in the future. So at this point, he says, I am not interested. And Boaz has pulled off a crafty and masterly and ingenious plan here. On one hand, he's provided justification for his marriage with Ruth under the guise of the Levirate law, which says the nearest kinsman, usually a brother, was to provide offspring for the widow. In addition, Boaz has linked the redemption of this alleged land with Ruth, at least in the mind of the other redeemer. So what's-his-name finds himself actually unable to redeem it at all, which is a nice touch of irony, the redeemer who cannot redeem. In the end, only Mr. What's-his-name, and that's all he is, and he's not a redeemer at all. It is Boaz who becomes the redeemer and thus the hero of the story. Now, I'm sorry that was long, but it's complicated. So I've got a question for you now. What do you think of this understanding of chapter 4 in Ruth? How does Boaz, Mr. Pillar of Society, appear to you now? And how do you think it'd feel to be a woman of this time watching this from a distance, having your fate decided this way? So we're going to go into breakout rooms again for you to have a chat about those questions. So, what do you think of Boaz now? What do you think of this part of chapter 4 now? What do you think of being a woman watching all this being played out in front of you? Any insights you have to share on these questions?
We thought that it was a cunning way that Boaz had like a whole legal construct put in place with these witnesses and an offer and then a counter offer, so that it was really his relationship now became a very solid part of the community. He put that legal cover over it.
Absolutely he did, which allows him, because he's legally bound to do it, you see, Once the nearer redeemer gives up his right of redemption, Boaz becomes the next in line, and he's got all that legal cover to support what it really wants to do, which is marry Ruth.
So obviously you could see him as being a very smart, clever businessman.
Yes, he mightn't be too smart when he's half drunk on a freshie.
Yes.
But he's got his smarts about him now. He's in the male domain, in the sunlight, at the gate. He's in his element.
We decided they made quite a good match. Because she's smart and courageous, and so is he when it comes to business.
Right.
And doing this at the gate, he's now legalised the covenant he made with Ruth the night before.
That's right. And that was for the whole aim of the thing. So Ruth might have been manipulating him in the women's domain, which is private and dark at night, in the male-dominated domain, which is sunlight and the gate and the legalese and the elders. Boaz is just as manipulative, except this time he's manipulative for old what's-his-name, who never has a chance with a name like that, let's face it. You know from the outset he's going to not win this one. So the pillar of society just ties up in knots what's-his-name's understanding and emerges triumphant. It's not a very moral tale, really. Any other insights you want to share on this?
We had a discussion about the women.
Yep.
And in the fact that we kind of thought that it was, particularly by the way of our standards, it was not a pleasant experience. However, we needed to go back and look what society was like at the time.
Yeah.
And then we looked at how in our time, what has changed. So maybe we're seeing it through a slightly different, we're seeing it through, we've actually got to look at what history was like and what, to say that maybe this was sort of the norm for some of the women at that time.
Yes, it would have been. This sort of, the Levirate law and negotiations about women as they were passed around different families and husbands or menfolk was their reality. And if that did not happen for you, you would be reduced not only to gleaning, but if you were younger, you may have been forced into prostitution. You may have had to beg. You may have tried to maybe eke out a living mending clothes or doing something like that, but there's not a lot of mention of that sort of very menial labour in the Bible. You're probably expected to be taken in by your nearest family who would look after you and that's why it mentions widows and orphans so much in the Old Testament, because if you were widowed, you really were destitute. And if you had a child to actually feed and clothe and put a roof over their heads, you could be in dire straits.
I've made a note of two quotes that I found when I was having a look on the internet on this subject. And I don't know whether they're drawing a long bow, but one of them suggested that Ruth's legal request is more than a marriage proposal because she seeks inclusion into the covenantal community of Judah. And another one was, in response to Ruth's request, Boaz asserts that Ruth is blessed by Yahweh, which further suggests that her legal request has religious significance.
She's certainly making a request. You could read that into it, though it's not specifically stated, and I'm not even sure that it's really symbolically stated either, but it's not precluded either. Mm-hmm. So you could make a case for that she is requesting the full privileges of an Israelite wife, not just the recipient of the Levirate law. And I mean, given Ruth's character and the story, that would not be an unreasonable reading of it, to see it like that.
Thank you.
And again, at the end, we see that's precisely what happens, which would strengthen that argument. Any other comments people want to make before we move on to the next bit, now that Mr. What's-his-face has been ousted as the Goel?
Can I go back a little bit? When I was in the Ezekiel passage, God talks about covering Jerusalem with his cloak.
Yeah.
I got the feeling that was a sort of proposal of marriage rather than just that there should be sex occurring.
Well, how do I know sex is occurring? Does anyone remember what it says in that Ezekiel?
Oh, yes, he wiped away the blood after the incident.
That's right. That's how we know sex occurred. And that's part of Israelite tradition, which is pretty horrible for the woman. Some families would actually come and check the bed coverings to see there was blood there to prove she was a virgin.
But in another quote I read, this is getting a bit boring.
No, it's not.
Said a request to spread the garment is typically related to legal protection and responsibility through marriage. It may be akin to a marriage proposal. And something else said that spread the garment or spread the edge of the cloak was interchangeable for taking someone under their wing.
No, it is. I'll go with the marriage bit, but it includes intercourse. That's part of the deal.
Oh, yes. I'm not saying it doesn't, but
I don't know about the taking under the wing. That might be pushing the envelope, that one. I mean, a lot of these people who are conservative, who write this stuff, get their knickers in a knot about what's really going on in Ruth.
Mm.
And they'll try and find all sorts of interesting ways of interpolating other stuff into it that is, in fact, not in the text. And doing what Ian said, re-sanitising it. We are not going to re-sanitise it today. We're going to leave it with what it says.
So you don't think that this is akin to a marriage proposal?
Oh, I think it is. I think she's asking for that, but it includes intercourse. She's offering herself at the same time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I was just picking up on what Piers was suggesting.
Yeah, no, I don't think you can separate the two out. She's not just saying, take me, I'm yours.
Go back to something you said earlier in relation to traditional Christian sexual morality, which you've pointed out
is Victorian.
The construct we have is a Victorian one, but isn't it something that dates right back to the very teaching of Jesus himself when he said, you know, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart?
Now, that's Matthew's version of what Jesus said, and no one else reports it. So there's a question mark about whether Jesus actually said it or whether it's just Matthew's idea of what the law should look like. Look, deviation in terms of marriage and sexuality and intercourse in the ancient Jewish world was a lot freer than you think it was. I mean, we like to read back into it our own hung-up Victorian sexuality constructs, and they're not there. Like, if you look at the Old Testament laws, when the only thing, apart from bestiality and incest, which are abominations, so putting those two things aside, the only real no-no is adultery. And adultery has very specific terms about it. Who can tell me what adultery is? Who can define it correctly? It's a trick question, I'll warn you. What's adultery? What do you think it is?
It's when the woman gets pregnant with someone else. Is that adultery?
Well, she can do that, no, but that's not exactly what it is.
That's not adultery. Or is it someone claiming someone else's property?
That's getting closer. It's only adultery when the woman is married. Now, if a married man has sex with an unmarried woman, that's classed as intercourse, and that's just a minor offence. It's the sort of thing you'd get for jaywalking. It's only a problem if the woman is married. It is not a problem if the man is married. So Matthew's up in the ante there, Ian. He's actually suggesting it's a problem for the man as well, which is a bit unusual. But, you know, there's a lot more toleration of sexual activity that is not within marriage in ancient Hebrew laws and, in fact, in ancient society generally. Than we have in our society. And the Victorians really did get us all hung up about certain forms of morality and sexuality and how that is expressed. Bill, did you want to say something? No, Ian, you have said enough. It's Bill's turn. Sorry.
just very quickly. Sorry?
It's Bill's turn.
Oh,
he
I'm
wanted
sorry.
to say something.
Well, that was a lifetime ago. I think one's probably gone now. But I was really just about the land, like whether the land was real or imaginary. Doesn't really matter.
Well, the fact that Naomi doesn't appear to know she owns it and she's not using it to alleviate her poverty does cast some dark doubt I think we've lost Bill. Yeah, he's tipped out. Never mind over that. Anyway, we are going to press on because we're going to run out of time. So we're ending in this chapter with a very different family picture than we started with. It's almost the complete reversal. Life has replaced death. Abundance has replaced famine. Fullness of life and fertility has replaced emptiness and barrenness. And God finally appears in the rejoicing of the community to help Ruth conceive a son to Boaz. And this tells you that Ruth and what she has done is blessed. The minute God shows up and blesses you with a male child, you are in fact blessed. And that is full kind of approval of what has happened. Now, what is interesting about this story is God doesn't reward and punish or manipulate the system. The important thing in this story is it's human action and human intervention that actually brings about this outcome, and God's grace is only bestowed once that action is taken. In other words, you're expected to do things for yourself. God isn't just going to magically make it happen for you. So the little genealogy at the end is something that might strike us as a rather out of place or boring and archaic addition, but it functions in a very, it's very crucial in the ancient world because it's telling you a number of things. The main thing it's telling you here is that Ruth is in fact the great-grandmother of King David, the most famous of Israel's kings in the biblical record. He was the great king of Zion, and the fact that she is his great-grandmother tells you that she is blessed by God. And what she has done is also approved of and blessed by God. And that's really important. And I've just noted there that, of course, Jesus is claimed to be descended from this same line and also from Ruth. So this, and he too had to establish this credential among his Jewish contemporaries that would have been crucial to his claim of being Messiah. So the man from Nazareth was descended from David. He was also descended from Ruth, the foreigner, the Moabite, who maneuvered her way into the family line of Elimelech through his kinsman Boaz. So without the story of the refugee and the foreigner, who married across these ethnic boundaries in the teeth of this nationalistic fervour in Israel at the time and became part of a new family, there would have been no David and thus no Jesus. So our very last question for you, we want you to think about just for 5 minutes in your group is, where is wisdom found in this story? And I've got some questions there about the story of Ruth and its similarity with our own times. And I wanted you to think about there about refugees and how we treat them and what it's saying about them. But I want to ask this other question first. Where is wisdom in the story of Ruth? Because we're doing Ruth in this series on wisdom. So I'm going to pop you into groups for 5 minutes and I want you to think about that. And I want you to go away during the week and think about the other story that I have, questions that I've posed about its relationship to us now. Okay, good people, welcome back. So where is wisdom to be found in the book of Ruth?
She took control of her situation. She didn't say, as a lot of modern Christian places say, oh, God is in control, don't worry, things went bad, but God is in control. That he's given us the ability to think for ourselves. She thought for herself and use, well, wisdom.
Yes, she did. And Proverbs talks all the time about that, does it not? About how you live and what you do is really important. And that's what changes your life. You are in control of that and you can choose a different various pathways. So, yeah, that's a good point. So wisdom is found in that aspect. Any other aspects you found?
We talked about Ruth went beyond her obligations to Naomi.
Yes.
And Boaz goes beyond his obligations to Ruth. And in doing so, invokes Yahweh in his what he did.
Yeah.
But perhaps, part of the wisdom is that we go beyond our obligations. We're not confined.
Well, it's certainly dependent on human actions. Wisdom says, you know, God helps those who help themselves, basically. if you wanted to sum it up like that. Yeah.
I was struck by the fact that if we look at Ruth being a Moabite, and so we're looking at the genealogy of Jesus, when you look at our society along the lines of marrying into another society, I suppose what comes to mind was the what happened over in Germany and the white supremacy over, you know, that's occurring. That it's virtually, like I said, virtually we're all should be able to move between some of the cultures.
Yeah, it's certainly bringing that up. And as I said at the beginning, it is a reaction to that white nationalism type thing that's going on with Ezra and Nehemiah. Anything else that people want to add? Where can wisdom be found in this book?
My sense is that wisdom is through the tough times. Like, you know, this is not a story where everything falls into place. People need to take actions and deal with some tricky situations and have courage. And that is where wisdom comes.
Yes, that resourcefulness, that resilience is things that wisdom talks about. Other things you might want to think about, this book's almost entirely feminine. It's got the main characters in it are feminine. It starts with women. It ends with women. It ends with women where Ruth gives birth and Naomi actually suckles the child. When it says she nurses the child, it doesn't mean she's holding it doing this. It means she actually suckles the child.
Wow.
Because in a sense, it's replacing her dead husband under the Levirate laws, even though it's Ruth's child. So it's very female dominated in that way. The other thing that you won't pick up because it's not translated is Proverbs 31. Remember we met the women of valor? I told you that there's one other woman described that way in the book, and that's Ruth. Ruth is described as that same thing, a woman of valor. So there's a direct connection there into Proverbs 31.
And Boaz also is described as a Gibor Hayil.
Yes, he is. He is a man of valor. Yeah. So you have these connections here. And of course, wisdom is subversive. She's doing very unladylike things. And you can see in Ruth her character. Ruth is also very subversive and how she brings about this outcome. She's not doing it by normal means, as it were. So
is the book of Ruth, do you think it was written by a woman or a group of women?
I've considered that, Ian. I think it's a distinct possibility this one may have been written by an educated woman. It has certain hallmarks about it that strike me as that would be a reasonable thesis. You can't prove it because none of these books are signed.
If it's subversive and written by a subversive ancient Hebrew feminist, why would a bloke be writing a book like that? Surely it must have been written by a woman.
Possibly. It might have been written by one of those displaced wives that Ezra and Nehemiah were trying to get rid of. And it somehow found its way into the canon when people saw the light and had more sense about them. Well, we've come to an end now of our study on the book of Ruth. I hope you've enjoyed it. Yes. I hope you've been surprised by it because it is not what it seems. And it's actually it's a rollicking yarn and a very entertaining read. So I would encourage you to go back over your notes if you have the time. I encourage you to think about that question. How does Ruth relate to our own times and how does it interpret the gospel story? We have one more session in our wisdom literature session, and that's John will be doing the bulk of it next week and looking at wisdom in the New Testament. Do you want to say anything, John?
It's called To the New Testament because we're going to look at some later Jewish works before we get into the New Testament. I'll be sending out a resource for you, and it will be largely biblical texts. And what we're going to do in the class session is look at various texts side by side and look at where do we find wisdom in these texts.